Luis stood in a large tube. The walls were clad in blue mosaic tile, forming irregular swirl patterns that chaotically intersected one another. It gave the impression of constantly flowing water. From in front of him, he could hear a roaring. Soon, a great white wall of water came crashing down the pipe. It rushed past Luis. The water parted, as if it was afraid to touch him. Before long, he could see something dark coming down the pipe, and he was assaulted by a wall of silt. The fine gray powder crashed into him, knocking him off his feet. He tumbled as he was propelled down the pipe, no longer able to tell up from down. With each full rotation, he was able to see a light growing ever closer. Finally free of the pipe, he was thrust into the air. He noticed as he fell that the silt flew ever higher, being carried on the winds. He wished for a moment that could be him before he made hard contact with the wet sand, jolting him awake. His eyes fluttered open. The already tight space beneath the tree had become even more claustrophobic overnight. The silt had expanded, packing him into the top of the root bulb. Pushing himself down into the loose soil, Luis was able to free himself from the root jail. Crawling onto the surface, Luis found himself being stared down by 9 eyes. A flesh-colored stem emerged from the muck in front of him, covered in tan sprouts, most of which ended in multicolored flowers. But 9 had borne fruit and produced eyes of various colors and species, all of which stared intently at Luis as he lay in the silt. As he got up and circled the thing, its eyes attempted to follow him. Straining to the edge of their fields of vision, it appeared the body of the thing, the stem, was not able to move. Luis was certain it wasn't there last night, but it did not seem to pose a threat. After the shock of the thing had passed, Luis noticed that his mouth had turned to sandpaper. Then that the sun had risen and he was still stuck in this bleak land. As he emerged from the roots, he surveyed the horizon. 2 things struck him as odd: the single bird that appeared to be circling, and the way that, despite the lack of clouds, the sky still matched the drab gray of the ground. However, Bahamut had given him one final gift last night. The fetid watering hole he had passed yesterday was just on the horizon. He would at least quench his thirst. As he moved across the silt, he noticed the ground that had been rock hard just yesterday was now soft. It was as if every particle was electrically charged, repelling one another, the way it spread and stuck to everything. With each step, his feet sunk into the silt, making the travel far more arduous than it had been yesterday. The distance that Luis thought he could cover in 30 minutes took him 3 times as long. As he struggled across the stretch of muck between his shelter and the necessary water, he noticed the bird continued to circle. When Luis was maybe 300 meters from the water, the silt became waterlogged, creating a facsimile of quicksand. Now the ground greedily grabbed his feet, attempting to hold them as he struggled to get closer to the water. Finally stopping in front of the gray water, he fell to his knees as best he could. Catching sight of himself for the first time since last night, his face still seemed unfamiliar without a beard. That had been lost when he had been caught in the coffers of Brassius. But what caught his eye was the large burn that covered the top of his head, stopping just short of his eye. He hadn't noticed how much the fire had touched him when he collided with the lamp. He shuddered to think how much worse it could have been. A drop fell and broke the reflection. He touched his face to wipe away the tears, but it was useless. Only the one was large enough to fall. Cupping his hands, he brought the pungent water to his lips. It tasted of earth, tannins, and decay. Still, it quenched his thirst. He greedily gulped down the acrid liquid. In the middle of his 5th handful of water, a sharp pain radiated through his left calf, like 1,000 needles piercing his flesh at once. He could feel the needles colliding with his bones and shattering. Luis struggled to free his left leg from the muck. With each inch he freed, he could feel the suction intensifying. As he released his leg from the semi-fluid prison, the source of pain revealed itself. A slick gray eel-like creature had attached itself to his calf. The creature felt itself pulled from the ground. This must have angered it, as the teeth began to gnash and wriggle in his skin, attempting to tear apart as much of his flesh as possible. Luis grabbed hold of the creature, trying to burrow through his leg. Pulling hard, the creature detached and came free, but the teeth stayed in place, a million little fragments stuck in his leg. Luis knew he needed to put distance between himself and the water. Half crawling, half pulling himself across the boggy ground, Luis felt the pain radiating from the open wound as he dragged his leg behind him and it jiggled against the open ground, causing the fragments to dig further into his muscles. Finally, the ground was solid enough for Luis to set himself down and examine the wound. The teeth had destroyed the calf. It was an absolute mess. He was able to pull some of the intact teeth and larger fragments from the flesh, and once as many pieces of shrapnel had been extricated as possible, he took off his threadbare tunic, tearing it into strips which he used to bind the wound closed. Luis attempted to push himself to his feet, first kneeling, which came easily, then using his good leg to propel himself upwards. He shifted his weight from his right to his left, and quickly came crashing back down into the soft filth, pain shooting up the inside of his leg. He would need to crawl until he could find something to splint the leg. Luckily, there were some decrepit trees in the area. Pointing at the tree nearest northeast, he began to crawl, each arm and leg fall cushioned by the cloud-like loam, almost beckoning him to stop and rest, is offset only by the foul stench that accompanied each time he pulled his arms out of the silt. The tree was maybe 3 meters tall, its few remaining branches barren. Luis propped himself against the base, catching his breath for a moment. As he sat there contemplating the best way to get back to Tassoon, the tree behind him and the ground beneath him began to shift. His weight alone had uprooted the tree. He shuddered, thinking about how exposed he actually was last night. But for now, this was a turn of good luck. He no longer had to figure out how to get the branches down from the tree. Breaking the tree into pieces, 2 shorter ones to splint his leg, and 1 longer for a walking stick. He used the base of the tree, hoping the flare of the roots would help disperse the weight, preventing the stick from getting stuck. Now, being able to stand with the help of the tree, he continued northeast, out of the gray, lawless land, towards Tassoon and his freedom. As he hobbled on, the ground slowly solidified underfoot, until it was the hard, sun-baked mud of the northern caliphate. Soon after he crossed back onto truly firm ground, he heard the rhythm of approaching hoofbeats. Turning to address the approaching rider, Luis was relieved to see familiar heraldry, a golden glove grasping a serpent pinned to his armor. Unsure of which of Brassius's men was under the helm, Luis was wary of immediately revealing he had the signet. An enterprising soldier might take the signet and leave him for dead. "Rider, I am gravely injured. Return me to Brassius," Luis shouted, while bearing the brand on his upper arm, making sure the rider knew he would anger his master if he did not acquiesce. Without a response, the rider pulled Luis onto the back of his horse, carrying more as an old bedroll than as a man. The ride was rough. He could feel each hoof beat against the firm ground as they shot directly up the horse's legs, but at least it was much faster than having to limp the remainder of the way. Laying across the back of the horse offered a new view of Tassoon. The squat sandstone houses that made up the majority of the outskirts looked almost monstrous from the low vantage point. Behind the huts he could see the Khedive's palace. The whole facade was clad in Mytherian tile. The gaudy facade caught the sun's light and threw it all over the city, making it hard for one to avert their eyes from the palace in Tassoon. The horsemen carried Luis further in, towards the monumental building. The only words Luis heard from the rider were directed at the doorman. "I found this thrall on the edge of the Grey Wastes. Let Brassius decide what to do with him." Luis was pulled off the horse by the 2 doormen. No sooner had he been removed than the horse and unknown rider departed. Left hanging between the 2 guards, he was quickly jostled into motion as the burly armor-laden men half carried, half dragged him into the council chamber, a throne room in all but name. He was unceremoniously dropped on the extravagant floor, clad in a combination of gold and the deep blue of Mytherian tiles. The opulence of the room made Luis squint into the diaphanous space bathed in midday sun. Luis recognized the sandals that approached through the disorienting light. The straps were well decorated in gold. They could only belong to a miser like Brassius. Luis scrambled to his knees, supplicating himself in front of Brassius. He used the humble voice one must when talking to the one who holds the contract on your brand. "Please, Master Brassius, I have completed my end of our bargain. Luis offered the signet ring, holding it above his bowed head. Brassius plucked the ring from the cupped hand, raising it to his face to examine. The face on the ring was a good likeness. The large beard was the defining feature of his face. However, the jeweler had managed to find sapphires in the exact color of his eyes, and managed to get the strange rightward notch of his nose as well. Brassius stared down at the nearly naked man supplicated before him. "Rise, Luis. You have held your end of the bargain, and I will keep my word." Luis raised his head from the deep bow he was frozen in. "My lord, I can't stand." He pulled forward his mangled left leg. Luis attempted to look as pathetic as possible while presenting his injuries. "I will do you a kindness you do not deserve." Brassius bent down and placed his hand on Luis's right bicep, just above the brand. As the hand grew closer, the brand began to heat up. The pain radiated outwards, consuming his whole body. In the brand, underneath the skin, small blue fragments began to glow. Soon the burning was as painful as the brand had ever been, pulsing through his body, but just as the pain was cresting its apex, the pain was gone. Brassius withdrew his hand, something clattering within it. Luis lay on the ground in a heap, no longer able to keep himself upright after such an ordeal. "Take him to the infirmary. This man has given me back my signet, and we will restore him to the condition we found him in." Brassius gave a stark commandment to someone else in the room. However, before whoever it was could collect the puddle of a man, Luis slipped into unconsciousness.